Now, tonight, we are so lucky to have a wonderful gentleman here who knows the museum better than I do, and he has been with the museum for many years. He's an incredible speaker, so knowledgeable, so loving, so caring, our own Dave Lindsay. And without further ado, the wonderful story of the four chaplains.
So a month after D-Day, near the French city of Saint-Lô, the Battle of Normandy was just heating up. In the confusion of the blinding smoke, the flying debris, the screaming artillery, Sergeant Bob Slaughter and a member of his squad hastily dug a foxhole for cover from the German artillery. He and his comrade had no sooner jumped into that foxhole than out of the chaos, a third man plunged in on top of them. When Sergeant Slaughter looked up to see who this uninvited guest was, he only saw a white cross on the man's helmet. Chaplain. Breathlessly, the chaplain asked, "Where can I find Bob Slaughter?" Totally astounded by this amazing coincidence, Sergeant Slaughter said, "I'm Slaughter, who wants to know?" Without wasting time on introductions, the chaplain quickly informed Slaughter that his father had died a few weeks ago back in Roanoke, Virginia. Slaughter's mother, with the help of her pastor, tried to get the message overseas, getting through as many channels as she could find until it finally reached its destination here, near the city of Saint-Lô. The chaplain expressed his condolences and apologized that he couldn't arrange for any time off due to circumstances, and he was gone. 2009, 65 years later, Bob Slaughter was still in awe of that battlefield chaplain, though he never learned his name, and he never saw him again. And I just lost contact. But he remained deeply grateful for this clergyman who had risked his life just to carry a simple message in the midst of harrowing enemy fire. That is a quotation from the book by Lyle Dorset called Serving God and Country. It's a great book. The account of this chaplain is not necessarily typical of what chaplains did, but neither is it unusual. What is unusual is the experience of the four chaplains that you saw in the earlier picture, and that you'll see very shortly, and of whom we will speak just a little bit later. So in keeping with the plan of the museum to focus on those who cared for those who served, we're going to be talking about the chaplains tonight, and I am honored to share a few of their stories for these unarmed warriors of faith who voluntarily left behind comfortable ministries and devoted congregations to go and serve to a world being torn apart by a vicious and deadly war. The challenge of serving God and country was their challenge, and they accepted it with grace. Now, if there's one unfortunate statistic to know about the military chaplains, it is this: there were way, way too few of them to go around. On December 7th, 1941, there were only 140 chaplains in the Army, and even fewer in the Navy. But by the war's end, there were over 12,000 chaplains who had served in all branches of the military. But if you divide those 12,000 by the over 16 million troops, well, you do the math. It ain't good. So that limited number of chaplains would explain why many veterans would admit that You know, I seldom or never saw a chaplain after I left boot camp. Now, there are several reasons for this disproportionate number of chaplains. It was not for the lack of clergymen who volunteered. The military had a problem. They were not able to draft clergymen into the armed forces. So they had to rely on appointments from church and denominational officials. And given the anti-war climate that existed prior to 1941, most denominational officials were in no mood to send their pastors off to war. Nor, I might add, were they inclined to accept any recommendations from the black theological institutions, believing with the spirit of the times that these men could not meet military standards. Consequently, very few black chaplains were accepted and appointed. But thankfully, that would very soon change. So applications of the would-be chaplains languished on institutional desks in spite of repeated requests. Those who did get appointments found these words in the chaplain's training manual, and I quote, "Chaplain is the servant of God for all, and no narrow sectarian spirit should color his utterances, nor should his personal work assist only a special group." Now, while these instructions sound really good, they seem to be a bit out of step with life as these clergymen had experienced it back in the parish, where there was considerable disdain felt between different faith groups, different church congregations. This is a crucial change. In chaplain training school, they learned that they would minister to all kinds of people. People of different faith, or people with no faith at all. As it turns out, the military chaplains set the stage for a welcome change in attitude in religious beliefs among the troops, and through the troops, ultimately, back home to the folks. So I say, this training was crucial in more ways than one. Now, of course, GIs being GIs, they found nicknames for the chaplains. They called him Chappie. They called him Padre. They called him Sky Pilot. I had no idea where it came from. Most of the time they called him Holy Joes. So, at the training camps, the obvious expectations of the Holy Joes, that they would hold religious services, they would hear confessions, they would give individual counsel, and generally just try to lift the morale of the troops who were there. Their greatest challenge, however, was boredom. Among the GIs, there's nothing to do. So the chaplains had to come up with all kinds of activities. They organized baseball games, they organized football games, they organized boxing matches, talent shows, song fests, anything they could think of to keep the GIs focused. And they realized that GIs with too much time on their hands, too much alcohol in their systems, would be in too much trouble with the locals. So the chaplains spent a lot of time doing PR work with the local officials as ambassadors of goodwill. On the battlefield, however, the chaplains found that their responsibilities were way different than anything they'd seen in the training manual. They ended up assisting the medics. They ended up praying with the wounded, retrieving body parts, making sure that the dog tags matched the right body, and writing personal letters of condolence to the families of the men killed in action. Something better than a pre-worded note from the government. Took a lot of time writing letters. Now, as a Marine general on Guadalcanal, who kind of filled in the blanks of what was missing in the training manual. He said, and I quote, "Chaplains must be permitted to minister in harm's way if they are to carry out their combat role effectively. And this must be executed in forward combat areas." Which brings about another little-known statistic about chaplains. It deserves a lot more recognition than it gets. The Army Corps of Chaplains sustained the highest per capita casualty rate as any other unit in the Army, save the Air Force. The highest casualty rate was among the chaplains. So, let me tell you a few stories of these chaplains. Let me take you first to the South Pacific in the opening stages of the war, and the experiences of one Wyeth Willard of Massachusetts. Willard was a graduate of Brown University and already a published author. He was in his late 30s when he was called to duty as a Marine chaplain. And he was sent to New Zealand along with the 2nd Marine Division in preparation for the invasion of Guadalcanal. So while he was in New Zealand, the troops are training, besides the regular worship services, he and the other chaplains with him encouraged the local residents in New Zealand to invite the Marines to their homes and to their churches in an attempt to build goodwill there among the locals, and also to build morale among the troops, not let them feel a little bit like home if they were invited to these people's homes. Well, it worked, and they felt at home. In fact, the New Zealanders quickly discovered that Chaplain Willard was an exceptional preacher, and he found himself being invited sometimes 3 or 4 times a week to speak in the local churches there. Well, that built a lot of goodwill. But as an ambassador of goodwill, he also worked closely with the MPs to get the American troublemakers off the streets and smoothing the ruffled feathers of some of the local officials. All in the day's work, I guess. One other thing that Chaplain Willard made sure to do, he secured the services of a local rabbi to meet with the Jewish troops that were there under his care, and they responded very well to that. And then things really heated up with the invasion of Guadalcanal. You imagine conducting worship services in the jungles proved to be a bit dicey. But, oh, there we go. I'm looking at the wrong picture. When they could, the troops attended these worship services. They were there, and these services were also attended by thousands of mosquitoes who either came for lunch or to be converted, I'm not sure which. But the mosquitoes and the rats and the snakes and the bugs, they were the bane of the existence of the GIs in the jungle. But they did come to worship services. But these quiet intervals were rare, and Willard and the other chaplains found themselves mostly helping the medics, carrying the wounded, praying for the agonized and the dying, burying the dead, and writing letters of condolence to the loved ones. Incidentally, Chaplain Willard kept a logbook of every Marine in his division that lost his life in the Tarawa campaign. Now, officially, the chaplains would be unarmed, but the Navy made an exception for the Marines in the jungle and allowed them to carry a weapon. Chaplain Willard explained it like this. He said, "I carried a Colt 45 because you just have to help the Lord sometimes." Yeah. Officially, they were to shoot snakes and other kinds of things in the jungle. But now, the Navy recorded that between the Guadalcanal and Tarawa campaigns, Chaplain Willard spent more consecutive time under enemy fire than any other Marine chaplain. Of the 8 chaplains who actually served on Guadalcanal, he was the only survivor. Oh. Chaplain Willard was mentioned in the Marine Times newspaper comments from Marines of the 2nd Division said, "Oh yeah, you can see Chaplain Willard running along in the front lines yelling, 'I'm Chaplain Willard, you can't shoot me!'" Well, for his service on Tarawa, the Navy awarded him the Legion of Merit, which is the second highest honor of recognition, second only to the Congressional Medal of Honor. Now, following the war, Chaplain Willard was invited to serve on the staff of Wheaton College in Illinois. And while he was there, he was commissioned to write a brief history of the college, which he called Fire on the Prairie. Well, Wheaton College just happens to be the alma mater of my father-in-law, and of my wife, and me too. Here we go. While he was at the college, serving on the staff, he also furthered his formal education by taking courses in Northwestern University, where he received a Doctor of Laws degree. So with his degree, he decided, I'm going back to the ministry. And he came back here to Cape Cod, where he founded a summer Bible camp for children called Camp Good News. And he hired some of his staff from among his acquaintances at the college. And it was at this camp, Camp Good News, down on the Cape, where my father-in-law met him. And two veterans, sharing old war stories, sharing old college stories, and Camp Good News is in continuous service even this past summer in Forestdale, Massachusetts. I want to switch from the Western Pacific to the Mediterranean theater and talk about a couple of chaplains who served there. One of them was named Chaplain Louis Werfel, a highly intellectual rabbi from New York City. He was well known and often sought for his teaching and for his intellect. Well, that is until December 7th, 1941. Well, he immediately offered himself for service in the Army, but they refused him as being not physically fit. It was not to be denied. And he worked to get an appointment instead as a Jewish chaplain. And his persistence paid off. He was finally accepted as a chaplain, one of only 311 Jewish rabbis who served as chaplain. Well, he made it known that he wanted to serve in places of greatest danger. And so with the scarcity of Jewish chaplains, he was assigned a special assignment with the 12th Air Force so that he could be flown around to different areas of the war and hold service for Jewish troops wherever he could find them. So I guess this is a military version of the circuit rider. And covered enormous distances from England, France, Italy, and North Africa. And we spent a great deal of time in North Africa, not only with the troops, but with what he found there was many, many Jewish communities who had escaped to North Africa, escaping Hitler's Europe. They came with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They had no synagogue, no rabbi, no Torah. So in his many journeys, Chaplain Werfel was able to find for them several Torahs that they could use in their worship services. His last mission to assist these folks and to the troops there in North Africa, it was cut short when his plane crashed in Algeria late in December 1943, right in the middle of the Hanukkah celebrations. The only Jewish chaplain to die in the war. There was another chaplain in the Mediterranean with an intriguing experience. His name was Israel Yost, native of eastern Pennsylvania. He grew up in meager surroundings in the upper Midwest. When the war came, he wanted to volunteer, which he did, and offered to serve as a chaplain. But during his chaplain training days, he took a lot of ribbing because of his name. They thought he was a rabbi with the name of Israel. In fact, he was a German Lutheran. He was sent to Italy with the Fifth Army. Well, maybe because of his name, but he did make a special point while he was serving in Italy to bring the Jewish boys among his troops into the city of Pisa, where there was a synagogue that had not been destroyed. And so every Wednesday and Friday, he made sure to bring these Jewish boys, whatever he could round up, bring them to the synagogue in Pisa. Well, then the army brass made the typical army decision. They assigned him to the 100th Infantry Battalion, nicknamed the Purple Heart Battalion. Now, does that ring a bell? The 100th Infantry Division? Dun, 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 dun. Well, a couple of years ago, the 100th Infantry Battalion was highlighted here at the museum because this group, reported as the most highly decorated unit in the war, was made up entirely of Japanese Americans who had evaded the internment camps by volunteering for service from the infamous Executive Order 9066. Well, so this group was made up entirely of Japanese Americans, except for their chaplain. You call this Army intelligence, I think. Anyway, here is Israel Yost, a Lutheran pastor, often mistaken for a rabbi, ministering to a group of mostly all Buddhists and Shintoists. But he made it work. And he tried to match the courage of the troops. And they exhibit uncommon bravery in helping to retrieve the wounded and the dead, oftentimes crossing over the lines, bringing back German soldiers with him. For his actions, he received the Purple Heart. He was wounded twice in his service. He also was awarded the Legion of Merit, the second highest award the Army gives. However, the award that pleased him most was the reaction of the boys of the 100th Infantry. When they found out that Chaplain Yost was being reassigned, they begged, they pleaded, they harangued, everything they could think of, confronting the Army brass and said, "You let us keep our chaplain," which they did. And Chaplain Yost never forgot this demonstration of affection, and he joyfully stayed with the 100th Infantry. And after the war, he kept up communication, in close contact with the men of this battalion, and from his experience, found in his own ministry that he was really focused in the attempt to end discrimination amongst people of different races and groups, what he had faced somewhat in his youth, but which the men of the 100th only knew too well. Chaplain Israel Yost. Now, in the awful carnage that was the experience in the battle for Italy, chaplains like Israel Yost received deep and heartfelt praise, not only from the awards given out by the military, but from the wounded men in their division, men for whom they ministered, men for whom they prayed. Chaplains like Gage Hodling from Needham, Massachusetts, my hometown, reports that sometimes I did over 100 burials a day. Men who remained, we appreciated that. Also men like Alton Johnson, Lieutenant Alton Johnson from Rhode Island, who served with the 752nd Armored Division with their Sherman tanks. You remember Alice out here in our display unit? Alice, the Sherman tank. Well, the M4s had a reputation of being a very reliable weapon. Easy to maneuver, easy to repair on the field. And some of the mechanics boasted they could change out an engine in a Sherman tank in just a little over 2 hours. Where are these guys today? We need them for our outfit. But the Sherman was also, had its downsides. It was lightly armored and was very susceptible to German artillery. In fact, it had received a very an unenviable nickname. They called it the Ronson, named after the famous cigarette lighter.
Oh.
And the advertisement for the Ronson was, "One flick and it lights."
Yeah.
One medic ruefully observed that if a Sherman tank was hit, all you needed to remove the remains of the crew was a tin cup and a spoon from a mess kit. Lieutenant Johnson commanded a Sherman tank in the Italian campaign, and he sent home this V-mail as a Christmas card. You can see down in the bottom corner there's a GI in his pup tent dreaming of his tanks towing Santa Claus with a load of bombs to Berlin with the hope he'd be home for Christmas. Unfortunately, Lieutenant Johnson's tank was hit by a German shell, and it did what most Shermans did, it caught fire. Fortunately, his crew was able to bail out, but they had to drag their officer out of the tank, badly wounded from shrapnel. The chaplains and the medics got hold of him with their prayers and with their plasma, and they did all they could to deal with his injury. And by God's grace, he managed to survive, although he spent the next 8 months in an Italian hospital before returning home on a hospital ship, and was not in time for Christmas. But he came home to a very grateful family, including his niece, my wife. And he worked for many years for the A&P stores in Rhode Island. But he was always grateful and spoke often for that chaplain whose prayers were so courageously given and so gratefully answered. His name, by the way, is on a brick at the entrance to the museum. As you leave, it's on the left-hand side, top row, the last brick toward the parking lot. And now we move to the Mediterranean. Well, from the Mediterranean to the icy waters of the North Atlantic, infested by U-boats. There's a very old ship, once upon a time a luxury coastal liner from Florida to the northeast, but now converted to an Army transport ship, the USAT Dorchester. The Dorchester is sailing to Greenland with 900 passengers, and on board among the passengers are 4 Army chaplains along with those 900, each from a different faith community, each having trained at Miles Standish Camp in Taunton, Massachusetts, and each of them glad to finally be heading overseas to minister among the troops. But they were all in agreement also that they had not signed up just to go and sit on an ice cake in Greenland and preach the gospel to polar bears or whatever else kind of life lived there. A temporary stop, the brass had told them. The irony of the situation cannot be lost. These 4 Army chaplains would face their only battle aboard a ship in the North Atlantic, where the enemy was not only the violent, icy, storm-driven seas, but a crafty, unseen U-boat. In the early hours of February 2nd, 1943, while the Pennsylvania groundhog awaited his yearly venture into spring, the 4 chaplains were about to become the 4 immortal chaplains. So let me introduce them. Chaplain Lieutenant George Fox was the oldest of the 4 by almost 10 years, and the only one with prior military experience. Born in 1900, he'd grown up in eastern Pennsylvania with a very overbearing father who was considering moving his family further west to a farm. As a teenager, George had looked for some kind of excuse, any excuse, to run away from home. So when the call for troops came in 1917 for World War I, that was just what he needed. So at age 17, he did a very unchaplain-like thing. He lied about his age and joined the Army. He was worried for a few weeks that his ruse might be discovered. But he arrived at training camp and survived the ordeal and was eventually assigned to the ambulance corps in the killing fields of France. It was not only hazardous duty, it was sickening, dealing with all those mangled and gassed GIs. My father-in-law, who had the same duty in World War I, said words could not describe it, nor would he. But Fox was inspired by the Mennonite boys, pacifists who would not carry a weapon and who served as medics. He was impressed by them as he worked for them, and he determined that after the war, he would pursue a career in ministry in order to help build a world without the awful carnage of war. Just days before the end of the war, he was badly wounded when a German bomb fell on the house where he was treating other wounded troops. So he came home with a 30% disability designation from the Army. They also awarded him a Silver Star, a Purple Heart, and from the French, the Croix de Guerre, for saving the life of a French officer. Now, the ravages of war that he had witnessed from 1917 to 18 impressed upon him the need for faith communities to work together to promote understanding and action that would prevent war like this from happening again. So he pursued a degree in ministry and was ordained as a Methodist pastor, and serving first of all as a circuit rider in Vermont. He actually served a church in Wright, New Hampshire for a while, and finally settled in the town of Gilman, Vermont, which is just a little north of here, across the river from Littleton, New Hampshire. And then December 7th, 1941 happened. So despite his scars and his 30% disability, there was no question in his mind. He knew what the troops would be facing, and he wanted to be with them. It was a gut-wrenching decision to leave his beloved wife Isidore and the 2 children. But he did feel called by the Lord to serve God and his country. So he and his now age-eligible son Wyatt enlisted in the Army on the same day. He would eventually end up at the training camp for chaplains in Taunton, Mass., where he would meet 3 other chaplains, all of different faith backgrounds, but all with the same passion as his, the desire to work together to promote better understanding among different faith communities. And they all became instant and sincere friends. There is Chaplain Lieutenant John Washington, born to Irish immigrant parents in Newark, New Jersey, in a city neighborhood with various immigrant families and religious backgrounds, who carefully kept their distance from one another. It was kind of a soft discrimination. But when he was a young lad, he loved to play hunting games with his friends in the neighborhood. And he had his BB gun, and they were off to all kinds of hunts for elephants and tigers and all those things. And of course, just like in the movie A Christmas Story, you know that movie, you have a BB gun? Yeah, be careful, that thing might put your eye out. Well, that's just what happened. They were playing one day, and the BB gun went off and hit Washington in the eye, damaging it enough so that he always had to wear glasses. Well, he loved to play sports, but he hated the glasses. So he chose on the baseball team to play catcher, because the catcher's mask would hide his glasses. And he was always fascinated by the services at his local Catholic church. And early on, he loved serving as an altar boy. And by the time of his high school graduation, he had fully decided that he wanted to pursue being a priest in the Catholic Church. Well, he went to university and seminary, was ordained a priest and went to serve in a local parish. He admitted early on he was a little bit ill at ease with the higher-ups. He really much preferred to be among the common people of the city parishes. Well, he did well as a young priest, and he was serving in his second parish church and making considerable impact among the folks, although not without controversy. Because he began reaching out to promote deeper understanding with folks from other faith communities, including those from the Jewish synagogue. Well, that felt a little strange to his congregation, and they weren't quite sure they wanted to go down this track, but they loved him. And then came December 7th, 1941. There was absolutely no question what he would do. He would sign up and serve as a chaplain. There was, however, this problem with his eye. When the inevitable test came for his eyesight, again, he did an unchaplain-like thing. He cheated on his eye test. When the doctor told him to cover his bad eye, he covered his bad eye twice. So he passed his eye test and was appointed as a chaplain. And he was sent to the training camp in Taunton, Massachusetts, where again, he met 3 other chaplains of like mind who matched his openness and his desire to serve at the front. And again, they all became good friends very quickly. Chaplain Lieutenant Alexander Good was born in Brooklyn, New York. He was the son of a rabbi, but moved early on into the area near Washington, D.C. Now, like other Jewish children, he experienced a kind of soft discrimination in the neighborhood where he lived. They weren't quite sure of those Jewish boys. But he overcame whatever discrimination he felt by excelling in sports and in academics. And he was good, to match his name. In 1935, he married Teresa Flax, who just happened to be the niece of a singer, Al Jolson. Remember him? Yeah. Okay, vaudeville it was. Well, he and Teresa had a great time, but they were poor as church mice. And they struggled to make ends meet during his student years, but he persisted. Eventually, he graduated from Hebrew Union College and went on to earn a PhD from Johns Hopkins. He was no slouch. His second appointment at a synagogue was in York, Pennsylvania, where he raised a lot of eyebrows with his desire to create interfaith understanding. He was holding several joint services at the local Lutheran church, and early on made history by establishing Boy Scout Group 37, which he insisted had to be a multicultural, mixed-race troop. The first troop in the U.S. to have the Scouts earn Catholic, Jewish, and Protestant awards. Well, the people weren't quite sure about this notoriety, but they loved him, and they went full speed ahead. And then came December 7th, 1941. Again, no question in his mind, he'd applied to be a Navy chaplain, so that any Jewish boys in the service would have a chaplain to work with them. But he was denied. He was persistent, however, and was accepted by the Army as a chaplain and eventually sent to Taunton, Massachusetts, where he met and became fast friends with 3 other chaplains of different faiths who shared his openness. Chaplain Lieutenant Clark Poling was born in Columbus, Ohio in 1910. He was 7th in a line of clergymen. His father, Dan Poling, had served as a chaplain in World War I, was a well-known pastor in the East. He was founder of an interchurch youth program called Christian Endeavor, something I belonged to when I was a youth. He was editor of a well-known Protestant magazine called The Christian Herald, which I believe is still in print. Well, Clark, as a youth, attended a Quaker school, and as a result, He had many serious religious discussions with his father, with whom he wasn't sure he agreed. But with his family, he spent many summers here in New Hampshire at a place called Wolf Hill in Deering, town of Deering, New Hampshire. They had a very large 20-room house there, and they enjoyed New Hampshire. There was a cemetery nearby that house with many graves of Revolutionary soldiers. And he visited that cemetery often and was moved by these men and their extraordinary commitment to freedom. And meeting in that cemetery with himself, he was moved to follow with his forebears and join the ministry. Although at first he wanted to follow a different career path, but his serious temperament and the desire to bring different religious communities together led him to pursue a career in ministry that was influenced by his summers here in New Hampshire. He was called to pastor a Reformed church in Schenectady, New York, where under his ministry, the church just grew tremendously. Following the disastrous events of World War I, he too grew passionate about bringing the world together under brotherly love instead of continual hate. He arranged meetings with local churches, including the local rabbi and his congregation, in order to promote understanding, reflecting perhaps a little bit of his pacifist teachings from the Quaker school. December 7th came along, and with the war in Europe and the war in China already well underway, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, his mind immediately changed. And he said he felt it was more important to fight for peace than to allow the carnage of war to continue unchallenged across the world. So he too applied to be an Army chaplain, and after preliminary training, was sent to chaplain's camp in Taunton, Massachusetts. So the aging ship Dorchester put to sea late January 1943, sailing out of Labrador with his 900 passengers. First few days, they were in the protection of Canadian waters, and the mood was somber, but it was laced with the expectation of finally getting into the action they had trained for. Now the chaplains could be seen moving around the boat, trying to get acquainted with all the troops who would be under their care, and again, trying to help lift the morale of these boys who were probably just away from home for the first time in their life. Now these GIs, remember these 4 chaplains. They remembered seeing them often together, enjoying each other's company, acting as if they'd been friends for years, laughing and seeming as if they were of one mind. And they said they had never witnessed anything like this before. Pastors of different faith backgrounds getting along like best friends? That's amazing. They showed their love and their concern for each other to all the troops as well. As they moved into the icy North Atlantic, they were met by a violent northeaster. And because they had to zigzag in their boat formation to avoid the U-boats, it meant that the ship had to slow down only 6 knots. Now, the violent pitching and rolling of the boat prevented any chance of engaging in the activities that the chaplains had planned for them. And the captain, ever fearful of the U-boat possibility, cautioned everyone on board to stay dressed in their warmest clothes and to wear their life jackets even when they went into their bunk. Well, most of the men were violently seasick anyway. They couldn't care less about a life jacket. Finally, the storm subsided, and on February 2nd, the sea was calm, but the ship slowed down to only 4 knots because of the presence of icebergs. You remember the Titanic? Well, the captain remembered the Titanic. and he slowed down. Still, he cautioned everyone, keep your life jackets on, even in your book. A slow ship on a calm sea, a perfect target for U-boat 223 on her maiden voyage. In the wee hours of February 3rd, a torpedo from that U-boat slammed into the middle of the Dorchester, below the waterline, and all chaos erupted on deck. Those on the lower decks in the engineering compartments, they were killed immediately. With those on the upper decks, there would be 27 minutes to escape. The chaplains made their way to the lifeboat stations and to the lockers where the extra life jackets were stored. Began passing out the life jackets to the men who had forgotten to wear them, and who ignored the captain's warnings. The crew valiantly tried to launch the lifeboats, but most had been frozen in place by the icy storm, and the list of the ship made it possible to launch the lifeboats only on the opposite side. As it turned out, only two lifeboats survived the ordeal floating. When the life jackets were all gone, the chaplains calmly took off their own and handed it to the soldiers who had none. One of the survivors remembers Chaplain Good taking off his gloves, saying, "It's okay, soldier, I got another pair." He lied, but given the circumstances, it's totally forgivable. Some of the men, the chaplains, were shouting in some very unchaplain-like language, "Don't jump," because they were too far above the sea. Others who were too fearful of jumping when the boat was just about to sink, they had to shout to them too and literally push them into the sea. They were so fearful. They wanted to push them in so they could avoid going down with the ship. As one survivor remarked, the chaplains gave some the strength to live and some the courage to die. In that chaotic night, many of the men in the freezing waters, the little red lights on their life jackets bobbing in the water, you could hear the sobbing of these young men who'd never been away from home before. Chaplains had no cure for this. But of the few survivors who were near the boat at the end, they would last see the chaplains, arms linked together, praying as the ship went down, singing hymns, and encouraging the men. Their only combat battle lasted just 27 minutes. Few survivors would tell the story the world needed to hear, a story greater than fiction, and one the world would not soon forget. John O'Brien said, the four chaplains were asking men to stay calm, and they were attempting to maintain order. Grady Clark said, I saw all four take off their life jackets and give them to the soldiers who had none. And the last I saw, they were still praying and talking with the soldiers. William Pantel said, I saw the chaplains standing at the rail, minus their life jackets, urging men to leave the ship in total disregard for their own safety. John Gary said, in the utter confusion and disorder caused by the torpedo, they were actually pushing men into the lifeboats. They helped save the lives of many of the troops. James Ward said, they were singing hymns and songs, and I knew they couldn't get off the ship. The next time I looked, the ship was slipping away underwater. During their training in Taunton, Massachusetts, Chaplain Good and another rabbi, David Eichhorn, and the priest, James Liston, playing a game of pinochle. Chaplain Eichhorn remembers a very strange conversation during the card game. He said, both Alex and Jimmy had a premonition that the ships carrying them to their respective destinations were not going to make it. Jimmy said, with a little chuckle, said, yeah, I gave $50 to a church in Boston for prayers for me in case I should be lost at sea. On the night of February 3rd, another ship in that same convoy with the Dorchester, bound for Ireland, was torpedoed and sunk in the Denmark Strait. On board was Chaplain James Liston. We lost 5 chaplains that one night. After the war, all 4 of these chaplains were honored with a brand new medal made especially for them, the Medal of Heroism. Along with that, they all received the Distinguished Service Cross and the Purple Heart. All of them are honored by the Episcopalian Church, who have now called a lesser feast in their liturgical calendar, which is on February 3rd, in honor of the 4 chaplains. Congress decided that they could make a special arrangement to print a stamp in their honor. So instead of the usual 10-year wait of only 5 years, in 1948, they came out with the 4 Immortal Chaplains stamp, which of course made its way across the world on everybody's first-class letter. There is a bridge outside of Newark, New Jersey, part of I-95, that is named the Chaplain Washington Bridge. Wolf Hill in Deering, New Hampshire, has been renamed Clark's Summit after Lieutenant Poling, who spent so many summers there. There's also an elementary school in Schenectady, New York, named after him. In the State House of Vermont in Montpelier, there is an oil painting of Chaplain George Fox hanging in the foyer. And the church in Gilman, Vermont, where he served, is now the George Fox Memorial Chapel. In York, Pennsylvania, there is a school named the Alexander Good Elementary School, where inside there is a mural with pictures of the 4 chaplains, and under each one there is printed this Bible verse from Malachi chapter 2 and verse 10. Have we not all one Father? Did not one God create us? Why do we profane the covenant of our fathers by breaking faith with one another? Why indeed? There are some who would blame military short-sightedness for putting these men on such an old, slow ship, or for being unaware of the horrific storm that was thrashing the North Atlantic. But in truth, the military's choices were very limited at that point in the war. Resources were few, and time was of the essence. I prefer to believe instead that the choice was really made in heaven. These 4 chaplains, who demonstrated such an openness to the troops and to each other's spiritual backgrounds, they became an example to the 12,000 other chaplains who served in all the other theaters of the war. Each one of these 4, from their own background and from their own passions, came to a training camp with a desire for understanding of those of other faith communities, and it was obvious from the start. In fact, I believe that's the largest story of the entire chaplain corps, because in the urgency of battle, they so demonstrated the common ground of their faith toward each other and to the men under their care that many long-held religious discriminations among the troops faded quickly away. So it was no surprise, really, that within a few years after the war ended, the Allied countries whose men had witnessed the work of the chaplains who had served together with many Jewish men and had seen the horrors of the Holocaust in relieving the torturous German prison camps, were now willing to move in support of the new state of Israel in 1948. It's also no surprise that within a decade, less than a decade after the war, there was strong national support for civil rights legislation in our country. As the chaplains had demonstrated, it really was okay for Catholics to talk to Baptists. It was okay for Presbyterians to associate with Jewish kids. It was actually fun to get to know their black brothers, and it was moving to hear them pray for you. So well beyond the 900 souls on that ship that day, the 4 chaplains touched the souls of the world without ever firing a shot or preaching a sermon. Let me take you now to the Western Pacific. Near the end of the war, preparations for the Battle of Okinawa. The ship is a USS Franklin, an Essex-class fleet carrier attached to Task Force 58, just one of over 100 ships in that great armada. Along with a crew of 3,500 men, there are 2 Navy chaplains, one of whom is Father Joseph O'Callahan. You heard it right, 2 chaplains of those 3,500 men. Again, the odds are not good. Some will say the Navy chaplains had it good. They could count on 3 square meals a day and a dry bed every night and a captive audience. However, if the battle came to them, and it would, there was no place to hide, and there was nowhere to escape, as the 4 chaplains knew only so well. This is the Franklin before March 19th, 1945. And up to that day, Chaplain O'Callahan's duties were pretty much routine. Hold worship services, hear confessions, be available to offer counsel, hear confessions, get to know the men of the ship, hear confessions. Well, that's the way he put it. Until the morning of March 19th, 1945. Out of the clouds that morning, a Japanese bomber broke through the fighter cover and hit the Franklin with 2 bombs that penetrated the flight deck, exploding in the hangar deck among the already armed and fueled planes, leaving it looking like this. Everyone in the hangar deck was killed immediately. And, quote, for the next nearly 8 hours, the Franklin was simply a floating ammunition dump in the process of blowing up. That's how naval historian Cliff Drury records it. So for the next 24 hours, what was left of the crew did everything they could to save the ship. Chaplain O'Callahan pitched in, doing whatever he could do to help, including over 400 burials at sea. The best description came from the ship's captain, who said this of Chaplain O'Callahan: I saw him manning a hose, spraying water on the bombs so they wouldn't explode. He was giving the last rites of the church to the dying. He ministered to the wounded. He organized firefighting crews and repeatedly, at the risk of his own life, helped to wet down the ammunition or assisted in dumping the red-hot 5-inch shells overboard so they wouldn't explode. O'Callahan is the bravest man I've ever seen in my life. Unquote. After the fires had been extinguished, O'Callahan continued his service. The ship was miraculously afloat. He was holding religious services in the burned-out hangar deck. For these actions and more, even after being wounded in the attack, Chaplain O'Callahan became the first chaplain of the armed forces to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. Now, there's a caveat to that, because chaplains being unarmed were not considered active combatants, and they were not eligible to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. Thus, the 4 chaplains had a special medal made for them. And it was after the war that President Harry Truman said, enough of this baloney. He deserves another one, he's going to get it. So, Chaplain O'Callahan received the Medal of Honor. After the war, he returned to Worcester, Massachusetts, and taught at Holy Cross College. And he is buried there on the college campus. Now, as the winter of 1944 and 45 began to morph into spring, all the chaplains in the European theater were about to face the most trying, stressful, and emotional challenge they'd ever known in their lifetime. This is especially true of the Jewish chaplains, as they were confronted by the inmates of the Nazi death camps, basically just living skeletons, alongside of the thousands of emaciated bodies. Nothing in the chaplain's manual could have prepared either the chaplains or the troops for the horrors of the brutality they found. They had to lean heavily upon their spiritual roots to minister healing and comfort to these devastated victims who became their primary responsibility. They insisted that steps be taken to chronicle what they had found so that the world would never forget what the Nazi socialists had done, especially to their Jewish citizens. I would not put up that picture. Let me take you to one more chaplain. Bearing with me. I'll take you back to the European Theater of Operations and the experience of another Army chaplain, Pascal Pat Fawkes, an Episcopal pastor from the rural hills of Virginia. When he enlisted, he asked to be placed in service with the troops on the front lines, preferably with the paratroopers if possible. Instead, he was assigned to a support battalion, the 314th Troop Carrier Wing, the ones who flew the paratroopers to their destination. His service took him first to North Africa, Italy, and then the Netherlands, which is where we find the amazing connection of this man to this museum. So while in the Netherlands, his battalion was in support of the troops slogging through the Ardennes forest. The sub-zero temperatures, the snow, the wind, and the ice proved to be as bad an enemy as the Nazi artillery in the killing fields. Chaplain Fawkes, as did the other chaplains with him, they carried the blood plasma inside next to their bodies in their pockets so that it would keep it warm enough so it would run through the intravenous lines to the wounded men. But he found himself, like the other chaplains, ministering just as much to the freezing, the starving, and the devastated Dutch civilians with whom they shared their meager rations. In one village, Fawkes came upon an open field where the Nazis had tied 100 civilians together at the wrists to form a circle and proceeded to machine gun them to death. How do you find words to comfort the remaining townspeople in scenes like this? How do you explain such savagery to your own troops? It's not in the field manual. It has to come from the heart. A heart that somehow is in touch with God, the Father of mercy. Well, his group was stopped in the village of Limburg, where a group of citizens had formed what they called the Citizens Committee. The Citizens Committee had been formed in order to build a cemetery where these brave liberators from America, who had given their lives to free the Dutch people, where they could be buried. So working with the Graves Registration Service, Chaplain Fawkes became the liaison between the Dutch and the American brass to accomplish what the Dutch people wanted. And this is what they wanted. They insisted that every American buried in their cemetery should have a local family adopt their grave. And the chaplain maneuvered through all the red tape to get what the Dutch wanted. It had to be arranged quickly because every day they were bringing truckloads of Americans there to be buried. Ultimately, over 18,000 Americans were buried there in the town of Morgroton. Each one adopted by one of the Dutch families there, an adoption program that continues to this day. And you can see the picture of it in Time Tunnel in the 1942 room. Well, spring finally arrived, the land began to thaw, and Chaplain Falk's greatest wish was granted. He'd be allowed to join the 507th Parachute Wing and jump with them in Operation Varsity to push across the Rhine into Germany. He was all excited, and he wrote a letter to his wife. He said, "Well, don't worry, I'll be careful." So as often happened, the plane carrying Falks and his group slightly strayed over the landing zone a little bit, and his men, when they parachuted, they landed in the field still occupied by the Nazis. So before he could get out of his chute after a perfect landing and run across the field, he and 5 others of his group were cut to ribbons by Nazi machine guns. One of his buddies, a medic who had jumped with him, would write to Pat's widow and say, "Pat was one of the finest men I have ever met or had the good fortune to know. I have never felt anyone's death as deeply as his." Chaplain Pat was buried with his buddies in the cemetery at Morgroton, Plot C, row 17, grave 20, and adored here by two Dutch children whose grandmother, Emily, was a moving force in the creation of the cemetery. In honor of him and the others buried at Morgroton, including several Medal of Honor winners, Robert Edsel writes in his book, "No ideal can be more meaningful than freedom. The heroes of Morgroton remind us how beautiful and meaningful that freedom is, especially for those of us who haven't done anything to earn it and who take our freedom for granted. They are a reminder of how horrible it is to lose your freedom and how difficult it is to get it back once lost." With this sentiment, all the chaplains would agree. And I thank you for listening.